psychonutrition is the supply of nutrients via the physical pathways, in this case the digestive tract, to the body, and also the supply of adequate nutrient precursor molecules so that the body can make sufficient neurotransmitters and other essential components of the nervous system. And that's typically where our modern diet is falling down. We've got some serious issues not only with malnutrition, and in some countries it doesn't matter how much you eat, the majority of people are malnourished from this perspective.
We're really excited today to welcome back Gary Johnston to talk about psychonutrition. Never heard of it? If so, you're not alone, and finding out about it can literally save your life. Just as your mother told you, you are what you eat. Just think about anxiety and depression, two of the leading dysfunctional mental health issues today. And we've been led to believe that these are caused by disturbances in our thought processes. But today we'll learn more about the effect of our modern diet, which is stacked full of sugars, processed grains, and other high-acid foods that damage our bodies and interfere with the normal processes of our nervous system. Our diet significantly contributes to the rapid evolution of anxiety disorders, depression, and anger. I'm looking forward to also learning a bit about orthomolecular medicine. That's a mouthful. In 1968, double Nobel laureate Linus Pauling published a paper in the Journal of Science. He was the first person to use the term orthomolecular. His vision was to restore our bodies to optimum performance by correcting imbalances or deficiencies based on individual biochemistry, using only natural substances such as vitamins, minerals, amino acids, trace elements, and fatty acids.
For those of you who missed last week's show on PTSD, Gary Johnston is the director of the Goulding Institute in Australia.
Gary studied clinical hypnosis and NLP in the 80s and 90s, which led to a period of teaching hypnotherapy and psychophysics at Melbourne's Australian Academy of Hypnotic Science. During that time, he developed his own stress management clinic, Quantum Mind Body, achieving great results for his clients.
Thank you for coming back.
Thank you, Jim and Lynn. Hello, everybody.
So, Gary, tell us, what is psychonutrition?
Well, it's a very big field, and it's something that to a certain extent has been ignored for quite a while. But it's to put it in short term, it's the supply of essential nutrients to the very sensitive nervous system that provides all the electrical pathways throughout the body. And it does that to organs and muscles and every part of the body that we need so that we can function properly. I guess you could break it down to two levels. You know, we were talking about orthomolecular medicine and psychonutrition. They're basically the same thing, but perhaps on a different level. The level of psychonutrition is the supply of nutrients via the physical pathways, in this case the digestive tract, to the body, and also the supply of adequate nutrient precursor molecules so that the body can make sufficient neurotransmitters and other essential components of the nervous system. And that's typically where our modern diet is falling down. We've got some serious issues not only with malnutrition, and in some countries it doesn't matter how much you eat, the majority of people are malnourished from this perspective. The other level is from the orthomolecular medical perspective. Linus Pauling was the first to introduced the concept of using what we would term an optimum dose of nutrients, in this case vitamins, to treat a whole range of disorders. And it has been used in the whole of the body, in different disorders, including polio and other areas. But it becomes even more critical when we start talking about psychological disorders, because the shortage of nutrients in that nervous system and in the neurotransmitters that function to transmit signals between cells in the nervous system, then you start looking at an extremely sensitive system that, if it's disturbed, will produce severe emotional problems. Everybody has a different method of getting food into them. Unfortunately, in our modern society, the damage that the prepackaged foods are absolutely massive. For instance, one component of psychonutrition that has been around for a long time, in fact, it was first identified in 1935, that hyperglycemia has been recognized as mimicking anxiety, neurosis, hysteria, and psychosis. So we've known that since 1935. When I first started this work, going back clinically, that is, going back about 25 years, I would have said that probably about 15% of the population were affected by hyperglycemia to certain levels. Now, 25 years later, I would say that's up around 35% of the population and climbing.
Oh,
Wow, that's incredible.
That's amazing.
It's quite scary. In 1973, Wendell and Beebe identified that there's a 73% correlation between hyperglycemia to anxiety-based schizophrenias. So it's quite significant, and there are a whole range of other deficiencies that cause quite severe problems.
Maybe you could give us some specific information about how this form of malnutrition affects moods in a variety of ways.
Well, there are a whole range of issues, and if you have a look at how the nervous system works, most nervous system cells that transmit information around the body, from not only within the brain but throughout the body, down the spinal cord, through the peripheral or the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, there are gaps between the cells that have to get those signals across those gaps, and they do that by releasing chemicals into the gap, which then triggers the next cell, and they're known as neurotransmitters. Now, those neurotransmitters, there are a whole range of them. I think there's about 80 now been identified, some that are quite well known, some are only small protein particles called peptides, and even things like nitrous oxide as a gas and those sort of things are actually now recognized as having an involvement in those pathways. If any disturbance happens in that, for instance, a neurotransmitter called dopamine, you then start seeing situations where people can't enjoy themselves. The whole emotional spectrum is depressed. Serotonin typically produces levels of depression if it's not there in sufficient quantities. Enkephalins are the feel-good neurotransmitters. If you don't have enough enkephalins in the system, you don't feel pleasure at all. So all of these things, and all of these neurotransmitters have specific pathways, but they are used differently in different parts of the body. Serotonin, for instance, is a really, really important one, is used in a large number of processes within the body for different purposes. But one of the problems there is that if you end up short of serotonin, then it's the nervous system that gets affected first because it's the most sensitive. So it's likely to induce depression. It'll change your mood very substantially. Shortages of dopamine, for instance, and serotonin will produce changes in your anxiety level, in your level of anger, in your ability to love. You know, all those simple emotions that we consider so important can be damaged quite dramatically by a shortage of any of those neurotransmitters.
And and you're calling this a form of malnutrition. Our processed foods is actually damaging the supplies of dopamine and these other. Yeah, well,
there's two components to that. One is certainly the foods that we're eating, and especially the processed foods, are short of many of the precursor molecules that are required to produce these neurotransmitters. And some of the big ones are vitamin B6 and B3, vitamin C. Vitamin B3, for instance, is used in over 500 processes in the body, but especially sensitive in the nervous system. Vitamin C, likewise, that Linus Pauling came up with, was very aware that vitamin C is critical to many biochemical pathways in the body. Well, if you don't get enough, and unfortunately most people now are not getting enough, then you end up with serious problems in a number of areas, not just the nervous system. But the other thing that's causing a problem is that if you go and have a look at the processed foods that most people are now eating, you find that the basis of all those foods are wheat, processed wheat, sugar, and dairy. And all of those products, despite what we've been told over the generations, now are causing serious problems. Sugar is just, I call it white death. It causes huge amounts of problems. Back 80-odd years ago, we were using on average about 2 kilograms or about 4 or 5 pounds of sugar per year. That's now up to around 50 kilograms of sugar per year. So 25 times the amount of sugar. That does all sorts of things. It changes the adrenal system. It changes the way we process energy. It overloads the system. It acidifies the body dramatically and causes hypoglycemia. And, of course, diabetes is a serious issue then, which from a social cost is massive. But what is usually not understood, or it gets ignored, hypoglycemia and the emotional effects, the mental health effects of that on a society in general are massive.
What happens, what do we need to do as hypnotherapists when we see people presenting with wide varieties of problems that may be related to this? What do you suggest?
There are a number of things you need to be careful of as a hypnotherapist. Whenever you are producing or inducing an altered state, what you're doing is you're bypassing conscious critical awareness and analysis, really, and accessing the unconscious directly. There is a risk there that if you are not careful in how you do it, that you can bring out something out of unconscious that you can't deal with. Now, you need to have people fully aware, fully, concentrating on what's happening to do the induction in the first place. One of the issues with an altered biochemistry is that because of long-term stress, which will be the presenting problem with these people, and getting a much bigger part of your professional practices, is that you're likely to come across people who do have severe biochemical imbalances. Now, we know that those severe biochemical imbalances can produce, for instance, ADHD, severe anxiety disorders, bipolar issues, and even the entire schizophrenia spectrum. So you're likely to have people that have altered perceptions in the first place and are not actually, while you're talking to them, are not actually hearing what you're saying. They're hearing what their unconscious is telling them. And quite often you'll find people, which is it's getting quite common in society now, where people actually hear voices. If you've got somebody that's not identified themselves as having a bipolar condition or schizophrenic spectrum condition, then you're dealing with a mind that is not reacting to you the way you think it is reacting. So you are not in control of what's happening. So we would always suggest in training here that nobody that is using hypnosis ever treats anybody that's been identified with any of those disorders without first dealing with that.
Okay.
Now, that can be two components. One, you can be working with a psychiatrist, for instance, and making sure that the person is fully under control under antipsychotics or antidepressants as a control mechanism. But that doesn't fix the problem. All that does is put a Band-Aid over it. In order to deal with the actual problem, you need to be dealing with the biochemical imbalances and the toxicities underneath that to actually fix the real problem that's presenting. So as a hypnotherapist, I would suggest anybody that is dealing with anybody that is extremely anxious should be identifying those problems in the first place, and where possible, either referring to somebody to get treatment and actually fixing the problem, or getting the information and making sure that you're able to do it and you know what you're doing. That's very, very important under those circumstances.
So we would be, at the very least, advising hypnotherapists who are listening to take a really detailed intake and be clear on what they're dealing with.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we actually have a number of intake questionnaires which will identify specific problems, and most of the symptomology of the schizophrenias, for instance, or bipolar, the paranoia, the depression, and a number of other factors that will show up quite clearly where a problem lies. So we use those all the time now, and I don't let a client go through my place without having a very clear picture of what's actually happening underneath what they're presenting with.
All right.
And we had access to those questionnaires so we could get an idea of what we're doing wrong?
Maybe.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, we can organise that to be available. We're teaching that as part of the psychonutrition and orthomolecular medicine online course that we're doing. So, right. but we'll make sure you've got access to those.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right. This has obviously far wider implications than we ever knew when we brought the topic up and asked you to join us. Do the traditional models of mental health cater to this? Do they address it in any way? For instance, I know doctors are woefully inadequate. I apologize to any doctors listening, but everybody pretty much agrees that they don't do very much that has to do with nutrition, and they get very little training in nutrition. So are those traditional models helping?
Well, yeah, that's correct. There is a very wide lack of knowledge in those areas in the traditional models. It's getting better. Certainly, I don't know about over there, but here in Australia, it's certainly getting somewhat better. Now there's about 3% of psychiatrists in the United States, for instance, using an orthomolecular approach, which uses high-dose vitamin B to deal with these high anxiety spectrum disorders, and especially schizophrenias and ADHD and those sort of areas. But it's still only a tiny part of the population. Right. Now we can't denigrate a lot of people rubbish the idea of people being on drugs to treat these things, but when you're dealing with a high-end anxiety disorder, you need to get it under control because of a whole range of factors. The suicide rate is very high. The emotional distress that these people go through is very high. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that you don't use those drugs or refer to a psychiatrist to make sure that somebody's taken care of, but that's not the whole model. What we'd like to see, of course, is that the entire mental health profession takes this a whole lot more seriously. There is a lot more research being done now. There are very specific pathways that are available now. Over the last 50-odd years since Linus Pauling started this whole episode in mental health history, there's been people like Hoffer and Osmond and Carl Pfeiffer and Friedrichs, Andrew Saul, and a whole range of other people, Ian Brighthope here in Australia, that have carried the banner. But it needs to be pushed a lot harder. If you get people well by having them on decent nutrition, you cut enormous costs off the National Health Bill. And that still hasn't been recognised. It costs a little bit more to be on a good, healthy diet, and it takes a little bit more time to prepare a healthy diet and to use nutrients to solve these problems. But the problems that they solve are huge in terms of costs, and not only financially, but emotionally, and what it does to families and what it does to societies. So, yeah, there's a whole lot more can be done, but right now the traditional models are not using it to the degree they could do.
Do you find that people that you are able to treat with psychonutrition and having them make this lifestyle change are able to get off of their medications? Of course, with the permission of their doctors, but are they? Yeah. I would imagine that's the goal. And people that come in for anxiety and for hypnosis are generally looking for a way to take care of themselves without going on heavy drugs.
Correct. And there's a lot of people also that are not on drugs that have been putting up with anxiety for a long time, that are just scared to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist for the fear that they will be labelled, and that has tremendous issues as well. But one of the other things that I find people are doing nowadays is that once somebody is labelled with something by the traditional model, say as a schizophrenic, for instance, well, the schizophrenic spectrum is huge. It can be all the way from fairly low-level disturbances and pre-psychotic conditions all the way to full-blown schizophrenia.
Yeah.
But you get labelled schizophrenic anyway, and then they'll go away and they'll Google it. And you can guarantee that if they had one or two symptoms, they'll go away and Google it, and within about 2 or 3 days, they'll have the whole lot. And that is a real problem. So as hypnotherapists, you understand, of course, that it's all about suggestion. And when you start putting those kind of suggestions into the mind of somebody with a biochemical imbalance, the effects are dramatic and very, very damaging. So we've got to try and control that somehow too. But yeah, I have a lot of clients that come to me that are on drugs and who just by even fairly low levels at a psychonutritional interventional point of view rather than orthomolecular, high doses of B3, B6 and a few other things that we do will actually lower their anxiety levels, get their thinking processes back, clear up their thinking, because most people in this category have very foggy thinking. Some of them have disperceptions where they actually see or have perceptual disorders. They see things or the ground moves under them. All those sort of things are pre-psychotic conditions that can easily be fixed.
I'm guessing that people that are under, as you said, you need to get it under control, that you don't want to completely denigrate being on drugs. They have their place and they help. But
and very important.
I would imagine that people that are on those drugs need to be a little bit assertive with their healthcare providers too, though, because like you said, once they get labeled, I'm guessing, and I guess I'm asking you, that probably they have a tendency to want that the physicians may always keep that label with them and be hesitant to take them off of drugs, where there should be a balance as they begin to pay attention to their nutrition and all of these fixes that you're telling us about. There has to be a way to be able to monitor the drugs and begin to get off of them a little bit at a time.
Yeah, and that comes down to cooperation with the traditional models.
And do you find resistance to that, or our doctors?
Yes.
Are you kidding me?
Well, I want to be fair. I don't know.
There is a lot of resistance, and that's unfortunate. And that's not because they're just stubborn. It's because they're not trained properly in those sort of areas. It becomes very easy to give somebody a drug to resolve a problem, and sometimes it resolves it, sometimes it doesn't. Different people respond to antidepressants and antipsychotics in different ways. Some actually makes it worse. But you get to a point where you have to work within the realm, the scope of the person you're dealing with. You can't go and insist they go and do one thing or another. So they have to be willing to go back to their psychiatrist or psychologist and work with them in coming off the drugs. You certainly don't want anyone coming off drugs suddenly. No. You cannot put an orthomolecular approach in front of somebody and have them just stop the drugs on the spot, because what happens more often than not, when somebody goes onto a drug intervention, that they then use that as the crutch. They don't do anything about their diet. Quite often their anxiety levels go down, depression levels come down, and they think they're okay. But in reality, the problem is still festering underneath. The real problem in biochemical imbalance is still getting worse. So when they come off the drugs, they get kicked in the head seriously badly. So they don't want to come off suddenly.
Can you give us some guidelines about what we can do to deal with this issue, both, people that are listening and are interested on a personal level, and professionals that are listening and want to know what to do on a clinical level? I know we talked about intake, but it's still pretty complicated to address.
Yes, it is. first of all, you need to get educated. And not many people are educated. And there's not a lot of information around in a format that anyone can just pick up a book and read it. There are a number of really good books around. Pfeiffer, The Schizophrenia is Ours to Conquer, is now, I think, out of print. But there are a number of books around that are incredibly good and cover quite a bit. Abram Hoffer has done a number of books on the schizophrenias and the use of orthomolecular medicine generally for everybody. But from first to address your question on a personal level, one of the issues that happen, and you'll be aware of this, I'm sure, that people who come into the mental health profession quite often come to it because they have an interest in it, because they have their own problems. And probably around 50% of the people in the profession have their own anxiety problems that need to be dealt with. And you can guarantee that there is probably a higher level of schizophrenia and biochemical disturbance in those professions typically than is even in the general population. So first of all, you need to assess yourself. You need to be looking at, as a person rather than a therapist, what your anxiety levels are, assess your depression levels, see what your thinking is like, and have it assessed by somebody else preferably. But even with the testing mechanisms that we have, you can work out if there is an issue big enough to do something with. Second thing, you can start changing your diet. Things like high wheat diets strip B vitamins out of the system. And when you do that, you do not leave enough B vitamins left to produce the neurotransmitters for your nervous system to work properly. And yet the diets that we're eating are very, very high in wheat. The other component of that, of course, is that things like wheat produce gluten intolerance, and at the top end of that scale, celiac disease, which destroys the lining of the small intestine. Now, no human being processes gluten properly, but some people are more sensitive than others. In people with celiac disease or a high level of gluten intolerance, the lining of the small intestine gets totally stripped out, and you can absorb probably about 10% or less of the nutrients you're putting through your body. Again, that creates a malnutrition situation. And there is most people with celiac disease or gluten intolerance are not even aware of it. They're just aware of bloating or gut pain when they eat. They're the things you need to assess and make sure that you're okay on. So you need to look at your diet from a personal level. Then from a clinical, and cut down the sugars and alcohol and all those sort of things, because they're all processed as sugars.
So start with wheat, alcohol, and sugars.
Yep. And also be wary of dairy. You know, we're told that dairy is great for, I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for saying this on air.
No, it's all right. We're the ones who might get in trouble over it, not you.
The dairy industry have always said that you've got to have dairy for calcium. But in reality, there's some serious work being done around the world. And specifically, there was a rather interesting study in China called the China Study that looked at a whole range of features of disease creation in China and how it was evolving into the Western diseases. And the things that came out were high meat diets, which are very acid, and high dairy diets. And the dairy, for a couple of reasons. One is that it doesn't fix the calcium problem. It actually stops calcium uptake.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's quite a bit of research done on that. But you're not going to see it in the mainstream. But the other thing is dairy is extremely acid in the body, and it contains a whole range of insulin-like growth factors that are designed to turn a 50-kilogram calf into a 500-kilogram cow in as short as possible time. But when you put it into human tissue, those growth factors actually distort the cells in the human body and create cancers.
Wow.
Goodness.
So digest
really
that one.
Interrelated.
That's unbelievable.
You know,
So
have to
it goes
close
against
down.
every... I'm sorry. Go ahead, honey.
I was just going to say we're going to have to close down about half the restaurants in this country are fast food restaurants, and you just hit the nail on the head. All of this comes from faster food centering around wheat.
I know.
Yep.
But we've been
the reason is, I've had arguments, well, not arguments, discussions with researchers and people in the agricultural industry. The move towards genetically modified foods to increase food production is fine. But in actual fact, for instance, in wheat, the current crops of wheats that are being produced are very, very high in gluten. And the 4 peptides that are actually responsible for gluten intolerance, which is an inflammatory disease, are actually increasing in amount in the new crops of wheats compared to going back to the ancient wheats that were quite low in gluten. So we're actually damaging ourselves by going down the pathway of trying to grow foods faster and cheaper.
I've heard pros and cons about going gluten-free, that people that have no problem with gluten shouldn't worry about having gluten-free products. But for what you're saying, everybody should. So
everybody is gluten intolerant. There's no one processes gluten properly. Our bodies are not designed to do it. There's Dr. Bob Anderson, who first did the work in Oxford about 10 years ago and is now working here in Melbourne. Identified these 4 peptides that actually always create an inflammatory reaction in the bowel. It's just that some people are more sensitive to that inflammatory reaction and end up destroying it basically kills the villi that line the small intestine.
Oh, my word.
And as a result of that, you end up not able to absorb any nutrient on a level that is sufficient for the body. So it doesn't matter how much you eat, you end up malnourished.
So now we've got people out there thinking, I have to cut down on bread and ice cream and cheese and all these things that I love, and meat and alcohol. Is there a way to do this that's actually, it doesn't sound like we can have very much fun eating anymore. Are there diets? Can we do this and still have flavor and enjoyment in our food?
Yeah, of course.
My wife always cut to the jugular.
Well, I know that's what people are thinking.
Yeah.
And we've been taught all these years to at least trust dairy, that cheese and milk and all these things were good for us.
Yeah, it's not a replace dairy with things like rice milk and almond milk and all those sort of things. So there are ways of doing it. And really what it comes down to is that the entire human race needs to get back to eating fresh fruit and veggies and smaller amounts of meat. There are people, I know that there are people in the United States just don't understand where vegetables come from or fruit comes from. And it's not just the United States, but it's probably been shown up more in the United States. But in reality, it is a serious problem, and we have to get back to more natural foods that are fresh, that haven't been stored for 3 years before they get to you.
Right.
We're actually going to the extent here in Victoria of building a permaculture eco-village to recreate a different social environment where the houses are actually embedded in the middle of a permaculture farm. And those sort of things I think will need to get about. But, people can build a garden in their backyard in about 10 square meters that will feed them quite adequately, just growing some fresh fruit and vegetables. As long as you create balance, you're okay. You can have some of the acid foods, providing you're using some alkaline foods to balance it. But if you keep eating acid foods all the time, your whole body will change and it will create more and more diseases.
I hear you. And even in an urban setting, we have many places now available for people to start their own little patches of gardens. In San Francisco, there are lots of community garden projects where people can have their own patch of land.
And that's great thinking.
But the life is so rapid in San Francisco that people do tend to try to get fast food.
Well, yes, I understand that, but what are your priorities? Do you want to be healthy and happy, or do you want to be fast and be rich and dead?
I guess, from what you've just told us, there are huge social implications for society that are pretty horrific. How does this problem present itself in the general population? I'm sure there's episodes of antisocial behavior, violence, that sort of thing. And can we reverse the damage that we're doing to ourselves in this respect?
Well, one is, that's a big question, because reversing it within an entire society is difficult. It takes education. But if governments around the world were prepared to put half the amount of money into education that they do into reactive medicine, that is trying to fix the problem, then yes, it would be fixed probably within a generation. But in terms of the antisocial behavior, it's been pretty well proven now by research that the diet has a serious effect. For instance, 60% of families with hyperactive children have diabetes, obesity, or alcoholism, all of which is sugar metabolism related.
Right.
There was a study done in the US prison system, where by changing diet to a non-acid, sugar-free, more natural diet, it reduced the level of reoffending by 80%.
Oh, my goodness.
75. Yeah.
Recidivism is based on diet.
Yeah, 75% of prisoners were found to be hyperactive as children, and hyperactivity and ADHD, of course, is based on a biochemical imbalance which can be fixed. So all of those things can be changed. There was a study, I believe, and I haven't been able to get a copy of this, but they did a study also on some of the mass murderers that would go into schools and do mass shootings and things like that. And a whole range of other fairly antisocial behavior. And they tried to identify what was different in the diet of these people compared to the average population. And what they found was that typically those people were using 3 times the amount of dairy products than the general population. Now, there can be a couple of reasons around that. It could be the use of dairy as a social thing within those families as opposed to having a direct biochemical influence, but you've got to look at both sides. So, yeah, the antisocial behavior that comes out of high sugar diets is quite high. There's a very high correlation between a high sugar diet and junk diet and suicide. There is a correlation between dementia and vitamin B3 dependency. Voice hearers, for instance, people who have psychotic symptoms in the hallucination or the range of hallucinations, visual and voice hallucinations, typically seem to generate or inject a thought directly into the visual and auditory neural pathways, which is really defective neurotransmitter processing. So all that has an effect in psychonutrition as well, or stemming from lack of psychonutrition.
That's hard too, because everybody has a litany. Everybody hears at least their own voice once in a while. But
yeah, well, voice hearers are actually different. Voice hearers with a hallucination actually hear the voice. It's not just a thought.
Okay.
But typically, and that can be quite disturbing. It's usually the voices of people around them, their parents and people who get angry around them, and they inject these usually abusive voices almost as though they're sitting right next to their ears, so they actually hear them. Wow. So it's not just a thought, but the thoughts actually inject themselves into the neural pathways so that it triggers the same response that is if you actually see something or you actually hear something coming from the nerves in the ears or the eyes. It actually interferes with that process and injects into those pathways so they actually see or hear the hallucination. And all of those typically are coming from defective neurotransmitter processing. When you use orthomolecular medicine to resolve that, quite often it goes away.
Is there any I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I was just saying, and sometimes quite quickly. Sometimes it takes longer, but it's quite effective.
We're getting more and more people coming into us who have constant litany. They listen to themselves, talk to themselves all day long. Not all hostile. Yep. It's not all hostile, but this could be dairy-related or acid-related, sugar-related. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that can certainly be part of it, but also self-image in the general population seems to be getting worse and worse because of the way we bring up kids and our obsession with things rather than people and relationships. Okay. So...
Is there a relationship of tinnitus to this, where people with tinnitus actually it takes a while for them to realize that's what they have because they believe that they're hearing something that really is there. They don't know it's inside their head. Yeah,
well, that can be part of it, but tinnitus can also be a copper toxicity. part of psychonutrition is you've also got to look at the toxic effects of heavy metals and other things that we put into our body. And copper toxicity can cause tinnitus as well. So there's a couple of different variations on tinnitus.
Where would you get copper to that extent in your diet?
Out of copper pipes, copper saucepans, all sorts of areas. A lot of drugs have high copper levels in them, for instance. So you can. Sense.
Gary, we're getting really close to, we have only a couple of minutes before we close out this show. So I would like you to have an opportunity to tell people how to take the course that you have. I know you have some online courses coming up, and also where mental health workers can get information to incorporate into their practice.
Okay. We looked all over the world. We'd been working in this area through the Golding Institute for quite some time, and we looked all over the world to find courses that adequately covered orthomolecular medicine. Couldn't find any, so we created one, and we now do a postgraduate diploma in psychonutrition and orthomolecular medicine. You can get information on that through thegoldinginstitute.com. That's thegoldinginstitute.com, GOULDING. And you can see the basic stuff there. In terms of using it in a practice, that course was actually put together primarily for psychiatrists, psychologists, medical professionals, hypnotherapists, and anyone else working in the mental health industry or profession. So it's very comprehensive. We cover every aspect of it. And we've drawn from a very wide range of sources and current research. So it's a very substantial course. And that's all done online. So you don't even have to go out of your office or your home. You can do the entire thing online, end to end.
That's great. That's
including evaluations. So that's up and running. And we're also looking, just as a side from last week, because we're talking about anxiety disorders typically being created by this, we're actually putting together a similar course in anxiety, phobias, post-traumatic stress disorders, and the schizophrenic spectrum disorders. So that'll be up later in the year as well. And they're all very useful courses.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we're down to 1 minute before we go off the air, and we want to thank you so very much for everything you've given us.